Welcome to School's Out with Sam Sorbo, a series about education, what you don't know, what you should know, and what to do about it. Last week, we saw the effects of the bureaucracy-run school system on your and your children's psyches, and I hope that gave you some pause and perhaps some insight into your reservations about embarking on the journey of taking personal responsibility for your children's education. In this episode, we'll talk about the elephant in the room, the unwarranted, conditioned fear we have of failing to adequately educate our children ourselves. We are all afraid of something. In fact, fear is a natural response to unknowns, but allowing fear to dictate to you, rather than simply managing your fear and understanding that living inherently carries risks, can be devastating. At a minimum, fear weakens and limits. Some fear standing out from the crowd. After our first episode of School's Out, we received a lot of mail, and one email in particular, from parents of a now 26-year-old young man, stood out. They said they had both been public school educators, and the husband was now a university chemistry professor. I mean, if anyone could homeschool, they'd be the poster family for it, right? Apparently not. Their relatives were scandalized. How could you deprive your child of his right to a public school education? Have you seen what's going on in the schools recently? What about socialization question? Well, first of all, that doesn't necessarily happen in school like you think it does. But secondly, what drives that question is the fear that the kid will turn out, like a freak. like there are no freaks in schools. In fact, in their email to me, this couple wanted me to know that their son, a successful, happy engineer, owned his own home and was an upstanding citizen, while his public-schooled cousins floundered, including exhibiting very poor social skills and aimless lives. What is it about school that makes people think that a rowdy room full of sixth graders or a playground smackdown is effective socializing? Perhaps most importantly, this couple wrote to support our efforts because, having been through it and having been part of the government school system, they want you to know you can do this, even if you lack the credentials. We'll add that you may even be better off without the teaching certificate. And that's not a dig at teachers. I love teachers. So, standing out from the crowd should not be feared. It should be admired. And traditionally in our culture, it very much used to be. But now, with our cancerous cancel culture, it is less so. And that's not right. Thinking people agree that the attitude of unforgiveness that our culture has embraced is downright dangerous. We want our children to excel, do we not? And yet we enroll them in a system that reinforces compliance and conformity. Do you see how backward that is? Common Core. Because every parent wants their child to be common. I mean, it's baked into the very name. And yet here we go each fall, like lemmings to the cliff, because we were schooled, steeped, some would say, in conformity and obedience. Let's acknowledge instead the sense of adventure that it is to stand away from the crowd. Oh, and by the way, homeschooling is way, way up, having more than doubled in the past year. So you're actually not alone in the slightest. But there is another fear we have to examine, and that's our fear of failure. So interestingly, failure is not the opposite of success, as we were taught. It's an integral part of success. In fact, failure is necessary for success. Truman Capote said, "Failure is the condiment that gives success its flavor." Thomas Edison said, "I have not failed, I just found 10,000 ways that won't work." One of my favorite quotes about failure is from J.K. Rowling. "It is impossible to live without failing at something. Unless you live so cautiously, you might as well not have lived at all. In which case, you have failed by default." Did you know that 12 publishing houses turned down the first Harry Potter book? All creative endeavors require embracing the potential to fail. But we hate failure as a society. Do you think perhaps we've been taught to abhor failure in school? It was often accompanied by ridicule, right? That's unhealthy because that's a deterrent to even trying. Fear of failure is a roadblock to any success or achievement. Last year, during the COVID lockdowns, a mom came to me for school advice for her son. The virtual learning wasn't working for them at all. And she was desperate for me to offer her a solution to how she could proceed, knowing I would advocate taking charge herself and educating him herself. Despite her faith in our public school system, she understood that COVID had broken it, at least for the time being, and she was desperate. Finally, she was at last willing to consider self-teaching. She sat at my kitchen island while I described the program I thought would serve her and her son best. She stared at me like a deer caught in the headlights, considering the amount of work she perceived self-teaching to be. And as reassuring as I tried to be, it's such a new paradigm, and we enter into it with such overwrought, misguided preconceptions because of our own schooling. It's really hard to break through them to get to the truth. I paused and looked at her quietly and said, "Trina, what is it that you are afraid of?" She looked down, she shuddered. And then she looked up again at me, her eyes overflowed as she admitted, "I'm afraid I will fail. I will fail him." I grabbed her hand and through my tearful empathy, I said, "You can't fail. You won't fail because you love him. Trina, you are a smart woman, a businesswoman, a writer with a ton of accomplishments. This will be another one. And it won't be decided next week or next month. You have time to experience and evaluate and regroup and redress. You will figure this out, and there are people who can help you. So take a moment to consider your fear regarding self-teaching your own children. Where does it come from? And don't say, "I don't know, I'm just afraid." That's a cop-out. Is your fear justified? Do you know how to read, think, write, and reason? Do you have any accomplishments to your name? Did you believe them when they told you that you were educated, but you're not? Or did you believe the lie that you're incompetent because the teacher said so? Okay. Would you please admit that you personally have something to offer? Or are you resigned to be superfluous? This entire miracle of a country was founded by homeschooled individuals, self-taught individuals, intellectual giants, who still by today's standards were absolute geniuses. For them, the Bible, history, and common sense were all they needed. The Magna Carta and the Mayflower Compact were enough to inspire in committee the incredible document that fomented a nation whose success is admired the world over. Self-teaching was enough for them. They never had the benefit of being taught in a classroom to regurgitate memorized data, a trivia for an exam. They learn through hard work and dedication to developing their minds. They also didn't react in fear, but showed tremendous courage despite the intimidation of the world's greatest superpower, Great Britain. Now look at our inner city schools today, or even some of our suburban schools. Metal detectors, chain link fencing, bars on the windows, child penitentiaries. It's no wonder that some call them gang prep centers and prison pipelines. In fact, a few years ago in Baltimore, 2 middle school girls bullied a classmate in the girls' bathroom, beating her to death. And within the hour, the school superintendent announced to the press, "Our schools are safe." All evidence to the contrary. Why? Why are we sentencing our precious children to these penal institutions? Because we believe their lies? Or because we are too scared to challenge the status quo? Or is it because we don't feel capable? And whose fault is that? At the start of the COVID lockdowns, the New York Times ran an op-ed titled, "I refuse to run a coronavirus homeschool," in which author Jenny Weiner, an associate professor of educational leadership, whatever that is, lamented the fact that many children may be, quote, falling behind so far that college will no longer be in their future. And maybe this is the perfect time to call a timeout on the academic rat race that was never healthy or fair in the first place, end quote. Really? Is this the New York Times or this particular quote unquote expert in educational leadership actually advocating for dumping childhood education entirely because homeschooling is too hard and too distasteful? This is the Washington Post. This article, quote, "Homeschooling during the coronavirus will set back a generation of students." Well, dire predictions from folks who are heavily invested in the status quo. It's all fear-mongering. Noticeably missing from all the mainstream reporting on the drastic overnight changes in the nation's children's education were articles on how to go succeed at schooling at home, words of wisdom or helpful tips, even from the educators, for the millions of Americans who suddenly discovered they were accidental homeschoolers because, I won't hesitate to point out, they were virtually abandoned by their public schools. It was almost like the schools and media outlets didn't want parents to even try. A friend forwarded a message that he got from his son's public school, a compilation of videos from all the teachers at the school and the principal to show the children during the lockdowns. Mind you, this friend lives in the ritzy part of town where the good schools are. In the video, every educator, and I use that term loosely, had wonderful sentiments about wishing they could be together with their students again, how they were spending their time, either walking their dog or baking cookies, and telling the children to be sure to wash their hands and stay safe.